Hello, and welcome to the Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. My name is Ryan, and I am a self-proclaimed Calvin and Hobbes superfan and expert.
And my name is also Ryan, although most people call me Indy.
And we are now over a quarter of the way into our podcast celebrating 40 years of Calvin and Hobbes. Can you believe that, Indy?
That is hard to believe. It feels like we just started doing this.
Yeah, already a quarter of the way, but at least we still got 3/4 left to do.
Right. That seems like a very Calvin and Hobbes kind of interaction here. Like, oh no, it's a quarter of the way over. Well, at least we have 3/4 to look forward to.
At least we've got this great box that it came in.
Yeah, now we'll have some fun.
Yeah. All right, now before we jump in, Indy, we got a couple more emails. So, first of all, we've got our email from our friend Mark, who emailed us before from across the pond and made us
All right.
international superstars, if you'll remember.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So he says, "Hi, Ryan and Indy. I hope you are both well following your progression to international superstars. Thank you so much for."
There we go.
Yeah. So it's official. He says, "Thank you so much for the shout out on episode 9 and for the kind words. Only too pleased to spread the word about your brilliant podcast." Thank you, Mark. I am flattered.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. I'm sure you're brilliant too.
Yes. Well, actually, to that end, he says, after listening to episode 9, I thought I would look up in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is basically the final word on anything to do with word histories and definitions, to look up when the word transmogrify was first recorded. I was astonished, as I have no doubt you will also be, to find that the first recorded reference to the word in print was, you are not going to believe this, 1656.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Even with that buildup, that's a lot older than I would have guessed.
Right, I know. He said he gives the definition: transmogrify, colloquial or humorous, to alter or change in form or appearance. I won't read the whole definition for you, but the dictionary says 1656, so that he remained for a time as one trans-elemented, note meaning transmogrified or metamorphosed into a mandrake. So there you have it, folks. I told Mark I would not have guessed that. Like if you told me it was pre-Bill Watterson, I would have guessed like maybe 1800s.
Right. I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, but I definitely would not have guessed 1600s. So good work, Mark. And it sounds like you are brilliant. So
Yeah,
thank
take
you.
that to bar trivia, maybe, if you have that. So.
Yeah. And then we got one other email from Graham, who says, "Hey guys, I love this podcast and have never been able to focus on a podcast until this one. I have been a huge fan since I was 9. I assume he means of the strip, not the podcast. And even gave an informative speech in high school. My favorite thing about the podcast is that you two are the only people I know that know CNH as well as I do. Thank you so much for everything." And
Wow.
I actually went ahead and followed up. I because as it turns out, I also gave an informative speech in high school about Calvin and Hobbes. Mine was on Sunday strips, so I asked what his was about, and he said that it was about the various personas of Calvin and Hobbes. So of Calvin. So I assume Spaceman,
Okay.
Spiff, Stupendous Man, Tracer Bullet. So very cool, Graham. Thank you for reaching out. We appreciate you listening. You are also brilliant and awesome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Graham. And that's a pretty cool coincidence that both of you did informative speeches in high school about Calvin and Hobbes. So
Yeah. So
very
yeah,
nice
very cool.
that connection with a listener.
Yeah. Thank you. So in today's episode, we'll be talking about a really important character in this strip, and that's Calvin's dad. As always, before we get into that, let's just make sure we're all clear that we're not affiliated with Bill Watterson. We're not affiliated with his syndicate. We're just a couple of guys doing a podcast about Calvin and Hobbes because we love it. And as such, we can't actually display any of the Calvin and Hobbes strips on our YouTube version of this podcast or anything like that. But we can write a blog post that tells you the dates of publication of all the comics that we mention, and also the books that they can be found in, including page number. So with that nonsense out of the way, let's talk about Dad. Who is Dad? Now, Calvin's dad and his mom are never given names. So Dad is just Dad. That's it. And Watterson said he did that intentionally because, as far as the strip is concerned, Calvin's parents are important as Calvin's parents. That's their role. So he didn't ever bother giving them names. But they're very important characters. And arguably, Calvin's dad is the first character introduced in the strip. I think you've maybe brought this up before, Indy, that depending on your perspective, you could see it as Calvin being introduced first because he's the first to speak, but Dad is the first person spoken to, the first one whose quote unquote name is said. And so your attention could be drawn to either character first.
Right. And even given like the positioning of the strip and Dad's taller, that sort of thing. So you might actually see Dad first. It's him washing the car. I guess at this point, I think it's kind of a generic dad type thing to be doing while Calvin comes to talk to him. So, yeah. So you might see him first. He and Calvin are the first characters actually pictured. And as I mentioned before, I feel like while Calvin and Hobbes is the most important relationship in the strip, obviously, you might argue that the relationship between Calvin and his dad is the second most important relationship in the strip. And that's subject to debate, but I think that's at least a defensible way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a really important relationship. You could try to argue that his relationship with Mom or Susie are equally important, but Dad sure shows up a lot. I mean, just before we started recording, we were talking about how much there is to say about Dad, and almost surprisingly so.
Yes.
That
So we kept
he's
saying like, well, maybe this could go in a different episode, so this one's not exorbitantly long or what have you. So we will have a lot to
yes.
say though.
So, listeners, if you feel like we didn't cover everything about Dad, you're probably right, and hopefully we'll get to a lot more of it in other episodes that reference things that Dad does, but also relate to other topics. Now, Calvin's dad is partly based on Watterson himself in physical appearance. So during the run of the strip, Watterson said that sometimes people have asked if, or even said that Calvin's dad looks like Bill Watterson. And he said, since all my characters are part me, that's at least somewhat true, but that he's in personality based more on Watterson's own father. So just to kind of break that down, Watterson looks like Calvin's dad in a way. He, at least in a picture that was taken in the 80s of Watterson, we can see that he looks like Dad with a mustache. I don't know if he still looks like that, but he did then. Or he looks like Uncle Max with shorter hair and glasses, whichever way you want to think of it.
Which makes sense because obviously Calvin's dad and Uncle Max are brothers, so
Right.
it would make sense that they both sort of look very similar to each other. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I would agree that I believe I'm thinking of the same photograph you are, and looking at it, it's like, oh yeah, that's Dad slash Uncle Max, or at least very close facsimile.
Yeah. And no pictures of Watterson have been made public since then. He did that one photo shoot for, I think it was like Honk magazine or something. I don't know, it was some magazine. And then he shortly thereafter kind of retreated into anonymity, which I can't really blame him for. So nobody's ever, like, there have been a few interviews with him since, but nobody's ever taken a picture of him that he's allowed to be made public. So I don't know what he looks like now exactly, but probably just an older version of the picture that's public, because that's usually what people do.
Usually,
But
yeah.
yeah,
Except for
uh,
Calvin, stays six forever.
yeah. I mean, I'm guessing Watterson doesn't have a mohawk or like, a bunch of tattoos or something all of a sudden, but I guess he could.
That would be a real shift from what at least appeared to be his persona before. So
Yeah, I mean, it'd be kind of awesome, but yeah, I doubt that's it. Uh, Now, coming back to Calvin's dad and his relationship to Watterson's own dad, Watterson's dad was a patent attorney, and eventually Watterson decided that Calvin's dad is a patent attorney as well.
now Watterson also at one point mentions that he thinks specific is funnier than general, which is another reason why Calvin's dad is a patent attorney instead of just attorney or more generic sort of office worker kind of thing. And I would agree with that. I think there's something to that. Like even what might seem like an irrelevant detail tends to make things funnier, and it definitely makes the world feel more real.
Yeah, for sure. And it also opens up the strip to certain more specific jokes, which we'll see in a bit. But I agree, it makes the strip feel like we've said before that these characters aren't just one dimensional, they have their shtick and that's it. They have various personality traits and various things that kind of make them more concrete characters. And being a patent attorney specifically is one of those things. Yeah.
It's also kind of an unusual job. I mean, lawyer is like a fairly prototypical kind of job to think about something someone might be. But when we add, oh, patent attorney, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
now it has this other dimension to it. Now it's this sort of more targeted thing. And like you said, it raises the possibility of maybe different types of jokes and storylines than you might get otherwise.
Yeah. Now, Calvin's dad, I just said that he's not a one-dimensional guy. He doesn't have a shtick, but he does have a few recurring things that he does that I think we all love about him. For instance, strips about building character, strips about fatherly wisdom, which may or may not be accurate, strips where he teases Calvin, which ties into some of that fatherly wisdom, and things like that. And all of these are inspired by Watterson's father. Now, my favorite example of this is the strip where Calvin is talking to Hobbes about how kids think whatever their parents do is normal. And then dad comes in from outside and says, "Oh, what a day. Up at 6, a 10-mile run in the sleet, and now a bowl of plain oatmeal. How I love the crazy hedonism of the weekends." And then Calvin looks at Hobbes and says, maybe normal is too strong a word. And Hobbes says he thinks they'd know normal if they saw it. Now, that strip, I just think the strip on its own is funny. But my favorite thing about it is that in the 10th anniversary book, Watterson included that one, and the caption under it says, "This is my dad, no exaggeration."
Which I agree, that's funny. Now, and maybe this is weird to say given that he literally said no exaggeration, but when I read that, I kind of want to say, like, but is it even a little bit exaggerated? Or maybe it's just I can believe he did all those, but maybe it's the fact that he describes that as crazy hedonism that I'm like, well, I don't know if I believe he exactly said those words, but I don't know. Maybe he did, and maybe we should take Watterson's remark at face value there.
Yeah, why would he lie to us?
That's true.
But then there's another one in a similar vein that Watterson doesn't say how much it is or is not like his actual dad, but dad is talking about how he's been up at dawn and running out in the cold, and now he's going to have gummy oatmeal and toast. What could be better? And Calvin suggests some dried prunes and a root canal, and dad says, "Dried prunes, do we have some?"
Yeah, no, I'm gonna say I think prunes are actually good. I think they're tasty. I liked them even when I was a kid. So if I were Calvin, I was like, well, okay, that seems fine. But yeah, the root canal, I think we can all agree, is a great
Yeah.
example of something horrific that no one would ever want. But
Man, spam, prunes. You just
hey,
you,
I mean, we'll get to the spam later, I guess. But yeah,
you're
you
ticking
got to
all the
get prunes
boxes.
right. Just
Yeah.
because they're good for you doesn't mean that they're not good. Although whether spam is good for you may not quite
Yeah,
be.
that's a little more
That's
debatable.
more questionable, but prunes probably are.
Yeah, I
Uh,
don't know if I've ever actually had a prune, but I mean they're dried plums, right? I imagine they're okay.
yeah, yeah. So if a plum is good, then a prune is at least plausibly good, right?
Yeah.
But in any case, yeah, you're right. And there's at least one more strip where we get this similar idea of what dad considers fun versus what Calvin and even mom thinks is fun. So there's one where he similarly comes in from outside in the freezing cold and he's like, "Come on, gang, it's great weather. If you keep on moving, you get your heart rate up and it's not too freezing," or something. And
Yeah.
they do not share his enthusiasm. And so first we get Calvin and Calvin's mom in unison saying, "Shut the dumb door." And then, even better, Calvin turns to his mother and says, "Just how long did you know Dad before you married him?" Which
And
that's one
meanwhile,
of my
mom is thinking there's one in every house.
exactly, yeah. So it's like clearly they think he's just crazy. And then, but yeah, Calvin's line is one of my all-time favorites. And it's like, "What is wrong with you? Like, didn't you vet this guy before you married?"
Yep. Well, and we won't hit this real hard in this episode, but it's a kind of similar vein with camping, that dad loves camping and Calvin and mom are not such big fans. And we'll maybe talk about that a little, but we're going to devote a whole episode to that. But
That's
it's the
true.
same thing where it's like, okay, mom, why did you not check this out beforehand? But anyway, so let's dig in a little bit to some of Dad's particular traits and shticks, and we'll start by just we do this with our characters, his origin. Where did Dad come from? And we don't know a ton about Calvin's dad before the strip starts. We get the occasional reference here and there, but Dad does mention his own father at least once. So Calvin asks if there were dinosaurs around when Dad was a kid, and Dad says, "Yes, your grandfather and I used to put on leopard skins and hunt brontosaurus for all the clan rituals." And like we've said, we'll get more into Dad feeding Calvin bogus information later. But there we get that, Calvin perceives his dad as being old enough to have been around when the dinosaurs were still here, and Dad's not ready to deny it. So maybe he came from that ancient amount of time.
Probably. I mean, if he said so,
Grown-ups are
that must
old.
be what happened. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
fathers know everything, so that must be how.
Yeah. Yep. And then we also know, so that we've got a reference to his grandfather. We also know he has a brother. We've already mentioned Uncle Max, who I find to be an interesting character. Now, Max appears in exactly one story arc. He comes to visit the family. And personally, I enjoy this arc, but Watterson said he regrets introducing Max to the strip. He says that he originally thought the family could go visit Max at his house or whatever, and that could open up some storylines, but it became awkward when Max couldn't address the parents by name, and he felt like Max didn't really bring out anything new in Calvin, so we don't get Max anymore after that story arc. Watterson says Max is gone.
Yeah, I also enjoyed that story arc, and I wouldn't have mind seeing more of Uncle Max personally. Now, on the other hand, I have to admit, it also makes perfect sense what Watterson says about awkwardness, since Max can't really initiate interactions with the other adults. So I think the only time I remember him directly addressing Calvin's father is it's in reference to Calvin. He says, "Oh, cute kid, bro." So he has
Yep.
to call him bro, and we can never get any strip where he says, "Oh, so and so," referring to the mom and dad, because otherwise, then we have to give them names, which Watterson didn't want to do. So that does make perfect sense. On that note, one other thing I find interesting is there's one strip where it's entirely Max and Calvin's mother talking together, but I don't think we ever get a strip of just the two brothers themselves. Does that sound right to you, that we don't see
Yeah.
something like that?
I don't think there's ever one that's just Dad and Max.
Yeah, which is almost strange, because you might think, well, they're the brothers. It would make perfect sense to have them just talking to each other. But maybe the awkwardness that Watterson discusses is one reason why we don't.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, on a similar note, there's a couple strips where we see friends of dad and mom who have come over to visit. There's two that I can think of. Maybe there's another one that you recall, but in these strips, in one, there's no dialogue. So it's just, this may be a Spaceman Smith strip actually, but Calvin comes down and he starts shooting at all these aliens. And then we see that it's actually, dad, mom, and this other couple who are now covered in darts. And
Yep.
so that's one, but the other couple doesn't have any dialogue. Then there's another one where they're playing cards, and then Calvin had punched some holes into the ace of spades, I think, in this particular deck, so he could throw it up and shoot holes in it, which is a great trick. But then we see, dad and this other man playing cards. On second thought, I think I'll fold. And then he says, "Hey, what's wrong with this deck?" or something like that. So
Yep.
yeah, so I think that's kind of a similar phenomenon. We never get any other adults talking to Calvin's dad or mother. I don't, well, except maybe there's a couple things, but it seems like a
Very
similar,
occasionally. Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know if I can think of any other strip where an adult that's not one of Calvin's parents is in frame talking to one of Calvin's parents.
So I can think of one, but that might be the only one. There's a strip where Calvin's mom is at the grocery store, and there is a grocery store clerk that says just like, "Oh, have a nice day," or something to her.
Yeah, that's right.
But other than that, I'm like you. I can't really think of one. So I think this is kind of a long-winded way of saying it's probably a similar phenomenon to what happened with Max. It makes it hard for the grown-up characters to have any kind of conversations really, which probably contributes to this. So again, I mean, I can see why this was problematic and why he would have decided not to bring Max back. But on the other hand, I enjoyed the strips like you did, and I'm not sure I entirely agree that Max didn't bring out anything different in Calvin. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, so I was thinking about that, and I mean, I can think of, Max isn't there a lot. He's only in about a week's worth of strips, but I feel like in those strips, the first interaction between Max and Calvin, Max says, "So, what do you say, kid?" And Calvin says, "I say you better watch your step because I've got a live man-eating tiger at home, and if I so much as wink, he'll rip your lungs out." So, I don't think I ever really heard Calvin talk quite like that before, especially to an adult. And towards the end of the arc, Calvin says, like, "Are you leaving? I don't want you to go," and like wants to go with Max. And he talks about the fact that mom is a lot more basically patient with him when there are visitors around. And so I feel like those are, maybe kind of subtle things, but things that we see in Calvin in those scenarios that we don't necessarily see much of elsewhere.
Yeah, I would agree with those. And you mentioned the thing where, oh, mom's more patient with me in front of others. We actually at least sort of see this, right? So there's a strip where Calvin says, "Oh, can I sit next to Uncle Max at dinner?" And
Mhm.
oh, okay. And then mom thinks, "Oh, how nice. He wants some Max, you should feel honored." Well, then we see why. It's because he'd put a whoopee cushion on the seat. And then, Max is surprised. Calvin thinks it is hilarious. The parents, I think, are embarrassed. But again, I think that does bring out a little bit of a different dynamic. And I don't know. If I think back to my childhood, what Calvin says seems to track. I mean, I certainly didn't get in trouble as much as Calvin did, but it does seem like you could potentially get away with certain things when company was over that you maybe couldn't if it was just your parents around, or I don't know. What was your experience like with that?
Yeah, I don't know if I can come up with a specific example, but I feel like that's true. Or even like with my older siblings, if there was company over and I was their annoying little brother, they were maybe a little nicer to me than they would be if I was their annoying little brother without whatever company over. But probably my parents too, just, you don't want to make a scene in front of company. So if your kid does something obnoxious, you maybe try to deal with it a little more subtly.
Yeah.
Actually, actually, I can remember one. This wasn't me specifically, but we went to a friend's house for dinner, and my parents felt probably correctly that us kids were kind of barbarians at dinner. And so they set down some rules about like don't eat with your hands if it's not finger food, and one of them was don't be a pig, and they'd given numbers to these. And so that one was number 2.
Oh,
And one of us,
easy recollection, and just trot out. No, no, you're ranking number three.
yeah, yeah. And well, I remember this because actually I don't really remember it, but my parents have recounted this story that they said to one of us, "Okay, number 2 at dinner with this other family." And the dad of the other family said, "What's number 2?" And so then my parents had to explain, even though they had tried to set up this code. But they set up the code so that they could try to be, a little more subtle and patient about how they corrected us if we were not having good manners at dinner.
Okay, so it kind of backfired, the whole code thing.
Yeah, it didn't end up working so well, but it made a nice family joke. So,
Fair enough. I had a sort of similar experience. I think it was just my mother and me, another lady invited us over for some reason, but we were having dinner there. And at the time, I was a teenage boy and teenage boys famously tend to have large appetites. And
right.
so, anyway, the meal that the woman cooked was really good. It was London broil and homemade fresh green beans, and I think some kind of mashed potatoes maybe. So, really good stuff. And I guess I was even more hungry than usual because I had like 4 helpings or something. And then to the point that my mother kept getting embarrassed. And I was like, what? That's a compliment to the host. It's like, wow, your food is so good. I can't stop eating it. So I don't know. So my mom might have wished she had a rule number 2 there for me that day. But
Right.
I still stand by my assessment. Like the lady seemed very pleased. You're like, oh no, I'm so thrilled that you like it. Have as much as you want. So who was I to contradict what the host wanted me to do, right?
You got to be a gracious guest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, yeah. So it sounds like we both sort of think maybe there were some different dimensions of Calvin that you get. And I mean, even just the fact that there's another party, right? So when it's
Yeah.
just dad, mom, and child, that's one kind of dynamic. If you have another person, even a family member, that just changes things too. So, yeah, I think there actually could have been things that could have been done or fruitful ground to tread with Max. But like I said, I do understand why he didn't come back.
Yeah, I can see why Watterson didn't want to try to go there. Would have made things probably fairly difficult for him as the cartoonist. So I don't fault him. But yeah, I think there could have been some other interesting Max stories.
Yeah, I would agree.
Now coming back to Calvin's dad's shticks and traits. So we've mentioned the fact that he's a patent attorney, but I think we need to dig into that a little bit more. So we know that eventually that this was an eventual thing. At first, it was just some generic desk job, but Watterson eventually decided this, and this shows up in a few specific cases that I can think of. So Calvin calls dad at work one day and asks dad to read him a story. And for a minute, dad pushes back, but eventually, quote unquote, gives in and begins reading Calvin the story of the hydraulic pump, figure 1, the wheel shaft flange, figure 2, and the evil patent infringement. And Calvin says, I want a good story. But
Yeah, I think Calvin actually has to guilt his dad into doing this. It's something like, oh, you'll look up one day and think, where has the time gone, or something like that. And that's when he, as you said, sort of gives in, but not with a very good story.
yeah, he's still doing his work with the patent infringement. So that's one of our clues that he's a patent attorney specifically, because I don't think the words patent attorney are ever used in succession in the strip directly, but obviously he's working on something with a patent infringement there. And then in one strip, Calvin comes in and tells dad that he's made this invention, and he shows him that he has this hanger sticking out of the back of his pants, and he poked it in there, and he says that it's a tail hook like airplanes use on aircraft carriers. So this way he can blast into a room at top speed, and the hook can catch a wire and stop him before he crashes out the window on the opposite wall. And he says, well, what are you doing? Get out the patent applications. And dad is not impressed.
Yeah, so too, I really love that kind of reaction. It's like, what's wrong with you? Jump up and do this. Like, are you crazy? So that's funny. But I have to admit, I'm kind of with dad on this one, just because when I read this, I think, well, but wouldn't he run into the wire himself? Like if he was running in, like how would it? Maybe I'm not envisioning this right, but it seemed
Well,
like
yeah,
his
and
body would be in the way.
Calvin wouldn't have presented this to his dad if he hadn't thought it through. Clearly, he's got this worked out.
That's true. I'm probably in the wrong for not realizing there's an easy solution to this.
Yeah, once his dad gets out the patent applications, I'm sure Calvin will show him the detailed design of how this wire will work without him running into the wire. I'm sure it's fine.
That's probably right. Okay, I retract my criticism then. Just
Yeah,
go on
yeah.
record here. Yeah.
And then in another one, Calvin invents a robot of sorts and wants a patent for it. So he goes to dad for help. And dad says, so what does the robot do? And Calvin says, well, that's the trouble. We can't get it to do what we want. And dad quips that he and mom got the same results after working for Calvin on 6 years. And Calvin says, har, har, my attorney is a comedian. So again, we get patents and attorney, not the term patent attorney all in one phrase, but Dad's obviously an attorney and he is involved with patents. So pretty clear clue here.
Right. And then
And
just a
then,
side note about the robot. Do you remember what the robot was programmed to say when you turned it on?
oh, something like, uh, how may I ease your life, oh grand and wonderful master, or something like that.
Yeah, because Calvin thinks, well, robots should be respectful. So hey, any of our listeners out there using GPTs or whatever, remember this is how it should be addressing you.
Yes, if it's not calling you master and lauding everything you do, you're obviously doing it wrong.
Yes, you heard it here first, folks.
And
You'll learn a lot
then,
from the podcast.
yes, this is an educational podcast. This is not merely
Exactly.
entertainment.
Edutainment, we call it.
Edutainment, that's right. Yes. Now, there's another instance that doesn't specifically tell us that Calvin's dad is an attorney, but it tells us a little bit about his working situation. So, in this one, Calvin and Hobbes get on a magic carpet, which is the hallway rug, and they fly downtown. And then Calvin says, "Hey, we could buzz by Dad's window," and so they do. And they're floating outside there, yelling at him, "Dad, look out the window! Did you bring any rocks? I didn't think to." But Dad will not look up from his brief, and importantly, we learn in this that they're sitting outside his 20th floor window. So we know that Calvin's dad works in an office somewhere on the 20th floor. So specific, not general.
Right. And we also get here, I believe Calvin says something. Well, there's two things. So, first, well, we can't just sit here all day. Serves him right if he can't even look out the window once in a while. So, okay. But his plan had been to give his dad a ride home. So, actually, Calvin was being kind of altruistic here. It's like, oh, hey, Dad, we could just fly you home on the carpet. It's like, well, he wouldn't look up. Serves him right. So,
So he
we
can
do.
take the smelly old bus.
Yeah, but I think to Calvin's credit, he is thinking about his dad and being nice, at least willing to be nice in this case. So that's
Yeah.
a kind of a nice moment there. We also see Calvin reference his dad being an attorney in a couple other contexts as well. So one that comes to mind, there's a doctor office strip where I forget why Calvin's there, but he has a reputation for not being very well behaved with the doctor. And it's something like, oh, I'll have you know, my dad's an attorney. He can sue you. So he trots that out. Then in another instance, when Calvin's poster does not win the traffic safety poster competition, he wants his dad to sue the school board and make them award it to him or something like that. So
Yes.
he's not above weaponizing his dad's attorney status either.
And also seems to suggest that Calvin doesn't completely understand what a patent attorney is versus other kinds of attorneys.
That's true. Although, I mean, you figure it's sort of like on TV shows, right? If someone's an attorney, it doesn't matter if it's criminal law, civil, whatever you have to do. It's like they'll be fine. Just
Yeah.
as long as you're an
They,
attorney.
they do the same thing with scientists where, yeah, I'm a physicist. Okay, tell us this thing about geoscience. Okay, sure, here you go. Blah blah blah. Like, as long as you're a scientist on TV, you just know everything about anything sciency.
That's true. And you can tell someone's a scientist because they have a white lab coat on, usually.
And glasses, probably.
Usually, yeah. So those things, especially in conjunction, you can get an answer on pretty much anything, regardless of
Yeah,
actual specialty.
absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about Dad's relationships and his job and stuff, but we haven't really gotten into his personality. So let's talk about his personality a little bit. And the first thing that came to mind when I started thinking about this was Dad enjoys cycling. Now, this one comes more from Watterson himself than from Watterson's dad. Watterson said that he enjoys cycling too, and that he does cycling strips occasionally in the same way that some cartoonists do golf strips. But he tries to focus on Dad's personality during these bike strips rather than just the cycling itself so that it can appeal to a broader audience. And I think he did a pretty good job of that. And I like how the family often makes fun of Dad's hobby. Like one time, Dad is walking by with his helmet on, and Calvin says something about, "How'd you get your head stuck in a bowling ball?" And just Calvin pointing and laughing at Dad as he walks by in his spandex outfit and making fun of how he doesn't know how to fix the bike. He usually makes the problem worse on the rare occasions that he actually knows what the problem is, and usually hurts himself in the process and stuff like that.
And
I think it works pretty well.
Even Calvin's mom giggles a little bit on one of these too. It's like
Yep.
she's not as explicit as Calvin, but you see her kind of trying to suppress a laugh. And he's like, I didn't design this outfit. It's practical.
Yep. And it also makes me think of, speaking of the mom, that one time Calvin's dad says something like, I think I'll quit my job and just go cycling every day or something like that. And she says, okay, dear, would you like me to call the bike shop and see if they'll sponsor your midlife crisis? And he doesn't even miss a beat. He just says, yeah, ask them if they'll upgrade my shifters too.
Yeah, so he's got this all planned out, it sounds like.
Right. And you mentioned the road safety contest before in the context of suing the judges so that Calvin can get the prize. And before that, Calvin asks his dad for suggestions for a safety poster slogan. And Dad is working on his bike, I think maybe putting on his helmet, and he says, sure, cyclists have a right to the road too, you noisy, polluting, inconsiderate maniacs. I hope gas goes up to $8 a gallon. And Calvin says something like, thanks, Dad, I'll go ask Mom. Why? That's a great slogan.
Yeah, I
He
really
has
love
opinions.
that strip because of how much a glimpse it gives us into Calvin's dad's personality at that point. So you mentioned cycling as a way to see this. I think that's a really excellent example of that. Like just that one reaction of him to what's a great traffic safety poster tells you so much about him as a person.
Yes, it does. It tells, I mean, not just that he likes cycling, but that he maybe has some environmental feelings. He doesn't like cars. He thinks exercise is good. Yeah, it tells you a lot about Calvin's dad. And worth noting here, at least briefly, Calvin does not like cycling. So this is apparently not an inherited trait. He has, at best, a shaky relationship with his bike.
Shaky, it actively tries to kill him.
Well, yes, that's true. I can't argue with that.
Yeah, and in one strip, Calvin either even attributes this to his dad. He's like, "Wait, I know." Calvin says, "I know. Dad knows that the bike is gonna eventually put my head through a tree, and then he'll finally get some peace and quiet. I'm on to him."
Right. Yeah, and
So
these strips provide some fun interactions with Calvin and Dad as well. So I think you had brought up Calvin. Dad tries to teach Calvin how to ride a bike, presumably among other things, wanting to pass on this hobby of his, and it has some pretty funny interactions.
right, so there's this whole arc where Dad is involved with trying to teach Calvin how to ride, and at one point, so Calvin's just freaking out the whole time. And Calvin's like, no, you're going to let go and then I'll crash. And he says, no, I'm not going to let go. Trust me. Trust you? I hardly know you. I'm your father. For what, 6 years? When I'm 40, let's talk. Yeah, so that's a funny line there. And then in that same story arc, Calvin's dad is trying to get him to sort of refocus. Okay, I want you to think of your goal for riding this bike. Do you remember what Calvin's goal is?
Okay, I think I've got this. I'm not going to get it word perfect, but it's something like, my goal is to disassemble or dismantle that bike and mail every piece to a different continent so it can never be reassembled, or something like that.
Exactly. To which his dad replies, okay, that's not a good goal. And Calvin says, well, I'm not changing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Calvin's pretty creative sometimes, even when he's panicking, it turns out. Like I mean, you could imagine like, oh, my goal is to never see this bike again or something, but no, it's really disassemble it entirely and mail every part to a new country. So that's some pretty creative thinking, I believe anyway.
I think it would get the job done for sure.
It should. I mean, there could be another bike, but at least that one would no longer be able to terrorize
Yeah,
him.
that particular bike can't be reassembled, and that's the one that's out to get him.
That's true, which we see on several occasions. Calvin will just be minding his own business and the bike will come after him, or he'll try to fight it and always get the worst of it. So
Yeah,
Yeah,
chases
Calvin
him
has
through
a
the
pretty
house.
justified. Yeah, chase him through the house, and then of course his parents get mad at him, which that doesn't seem very fair.
Yeah, that he was running for his life from this killer machine, and all they care about is the tire tracks on the hallway rug or whatever.
And the oil on the couch.
Furniture.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, on the note of cycling, but as a little bit of an aside, there's a magazine that Calvin subscribes to, which is nothing to do with bicycling itself. It's called Chewing Magazine, which relates because it's a sort of spoof on the cycling magazines that Watterson liked to read and maybe still does. I don't know if that's still a hobby of his or not. But he said directly that the silly articles he makes up for chewing are so close to the real thing in his magazines that it's hardly satire.
Right. And chewing is because Calvin has a hobby of chewing gum. And so he has
Right.
to get Chewing Magazine, which tells you about all the accessories you need and things like, a quiz. Are you getting the most out of your gum's consistency? Silly
Yep.
things. But I think that's probably right. Like when you have a hobby magazine, there's probably going to be some useful information, but there's probably going to be a lot of ridiculous fluff also.
You got to fill the pages with something.
Exactly. And then, kind of on a side point, but there's one strip where we see Calvin's mom reading a magazine, and the title appears to be just Woman's Magazine, which I think is funny. It's just like, well, this is woman's stuff. There's your magazine.
Yeah. And, interestingly, I looked it up when I saw that you wrote that. And there is actually a magazine called Women's Magazine, which
Wow.
not
Okay.
quite the same as Woman's Magazine, but basically the same thing. And there's also apparently a magazine that is just called Woman. I'm not sure how widely circulated it is, but it came up on my Google search, and so now that's in my browser history. But anyway, um, and then there's one called Professional Woman's Magazine, and then there's a whole bunch of others. So I agree, it's funny that that's the title that Watterson chose for the magazine Mom's reading, but also apparently plausible.
I guess so. Yeah. I suppose there's one that's in real life called Woman's Day or something like that.
Hmm.
I feel like
Yeah,
I've seen, but yeah, either way, I still just find that funny. It's like we don't even need to come up with some more specific title. It's just woman's magazine. If she's a woman, here's your magazine. There you go. Like, I don't know. It
yeah,
makes me chuckle.
yeah. Now, I think we've established in previous episodes that I'm the master of the segue, so here we go. We're gonna shift gears. Ah, there's my segue. Shift gears. Speaking of
Yeah.
bikes, let's shift
No pun
gears.
intended. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we've talked about Calvin's dad's personality kind of by itself, but we got to talk about the relationship between dad and Calvin. So let's start with this idea that Calvin takes polls of how his dad's doing. And I think we'll probably hit this more in depth in another episode, but just briefly, Calvin seems to have in his mind that the office of dad is an elected position and that he can get household policies changed by threatening dad with not being reelected. So, scandals perpetrated by dad include things like homework gate and bedtime gate, which do you remember how dad characterizes those?
Let's see. I think he does something like true instances of leadership. I will be vindicated by history or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, it's something like that. And I believe that's the one where Calvin says, I wonder what my new dad will look like. Um, but so there are several strips where Calvin does polls. And like I say, we're not going to hit all of them now, but a couple that come to mind just to bring up quickly. In one, Calvin asks dad if he's picked a running mate for the upcoming election. And dad says, my running mate? And he says, well, you can't be dad without mom. So are you going to stick with the mom I've had, or are you going to pick a new one? And dad says, gee. And then mom shows up in frame with a fist cocked next to dad's head. And she says, bedtime, Calvin. While dad says, of course I'll stick with your mother.
Yeah, and something interesting about this example is that it's the only indication where Calvin suggests that mom might also be an elected position. So there
Yeah.
are never any polls for mom or otherwise the same kind of criticism of mom's actions. Now, that's not to say that Calvin likes everything his mother does, but if he is unhappy with her, it never seems to rise to the level of scandal or never generates any data about constituent attitudes like his dad's unpopular policies tend to do.
Right. Yeah, I guess he perceives them a little differently. Although apparently, at least in his one strip, yeah, he thinks that uh, mom is like vice president, which, take that however you will, I guess.
I do know on
Um,
a like this is kind of a side note again, but I remember when Biden was elected, I remember someone I knew had small children who were confused about the whole thing and kept thinking Kamala Harris must be Joe Biden's wife. And they're like, no, that's not who she is. She's the vice president. But this, these were very small children. But so to them, that was a similar dynamic. I think, oh, well, if you're elected and you have someone who's elected with you, you must be married to them, right? So Calvin
yeah,
was ahead of his time in that regard here.
there you go. Yeah, that's what it was. And one other polls strip that I just want to bring up quickly because I think it's funny. In one case, Calvin is talking about election and Dad says, "Sorry, Calvin, I was appointed dad for life." And Calvin says, "Well, what about impeachment?" And uh, what about removal from office? And Dad says there are no provisions for either. And so Calvin says, "In short, the only hope for change is open revolt." And Dad does not like the direction of that conversation.
Right. And not just open revolt and exile. So
Yes.
even worse.
Yeah. I wonder
Yeah,
where
it's
actually.
interesting. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I wonder what Calvin had in mind for the destination for exile, but we may actually get a hint about that in a minute.
Okay. And right, so this seems to be what Calvin decides is the only hope for real change. I mean, we all want political change, and Calvin knows this is the only way to get it. But despite that, after this fact, he still talks about polls and elections. So he seems to revert to the idea that dad is an elected position or that he'll somehow respond to polling pressure even after learning otherwise here.
Unless you read Calvin and Hobbes in the way we've talked about before, like in the Christmas episode, where it's a 10-year strip, but it's all while he's 6. And so it's not necessarily presenting everything in chronological order.
Oh, that's
So it could be that even though that's not the last polls strip, that's the last time that Calvin brings up polls.
I see. That's intriguing. So if we read
Yeah.
that as actually being the last one, even though that's not where the strip appears chronologically, we could take it that way. That's intriguing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I definitely did not just come up with that right now. That is a deep thought that I've had for many eons.
Well, I applaud you for saving it for the exact right moment then.
Yes, yes. I've been holding on to that just knowing that you were going to bring this up.
Well done.
Yeah. So there's
Okay.
the polls. Calvin has some things about dad's policies that he doesn't like bedtime gate and homework gate, and he wants later bedtimes and fewer baths and all that stuff. But there are some positive aspects to their relationship. So every night, at least I think every night, dad
Most
reads Calvin. Yeah, at least most nights, dad reads Calvin bedtime stories. Now, of course, the favorite, as we've mentioned before, is Hamster Huey and the Gooey Kablooey. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on Hamster Huey. We'll probably hit that more in another episode, but that's the story that comes up the most often.
right. And I think we've mentioned before too that dad is actually the one to pick out this story first. So he suggests it to Calvin, and Calvin's initially skeptical of this, but oh, how the tables turn on that one.
Yes, and I'm not going to go into too many spoilers for the rest of the context of this strip, but I will just say that at one point, Calvin's dad says that architects should be forced to live in the buildings they design, and children's book authors should be forced to read their stories every night for the rest of their stupid lives. So
Yeah,
that's how he feels about Hamster Huey.
yes, we'll definitely have a lot more to say about Hamster Huey in a future episode.
Absolutely. Now, in addition to that story, Calvin's dad does sometimes read stories written by Calvin and or Hobbes. So here's where I was saying we might get a clue into what Calvin might have in mind for exile. There's one story called, well, actually, I don't remember what it's called off the top, but it
I
goes,
think I know it's something like I think the title is "The Dad Who Regretted Being Mean to His Kid."
Yes, I believe that's right. Yeah, I think you've got it. And it
And
goes,
Dad hesitates to start reading this, and Calvin's like, "Well, what are you waiting for?"
yes, and it goes, Barney's dad was really bad, so Barney hatched a plan. When his dad said, eat your peas, Barney shouted no and ran. Barney tricked his mean old dad and locked him in the cellar. So there we go, point of exile.
Okay.
His mom never found out where he'd gone because Barney didn't tell her. There his dad spent his life eating mice and gruel. With every bite for 50 years, he was sorry he'd been cruel. The end. You know how some stories have morals?
I get it. I get it. Yeah,
And
that
then
whole
there's,
thing is oh sorry. This whole thing is very cute too. And we see the illustrations for this, so
yes,
done by Calvin and or Hobbes. And it's cute too, because you have these, very childlike drawings, but there's arrows to label things too. Like in the end,
mm-hmm.
you have an arrow pointing to the mice, I think an arrow pointing to the gruel, and then we
Yep.
see him there. So yeah, I find that pretty charming, the illustrations that go along with it.
And very accurate. I mean, I remember doing that sort of thing with my drawings as a kid, thinking, "Oh, people may not be able to tell what this is, so let me just put an arrow here."
Yeah, I think I've done that too as a child. And we see other examples of this from Calvin and Hobbes drawings too. Like one that comes to mind, I think, and this is later, but they have like a schematic almost charting out how they're going to
Mm.
sled down the hill and do a snowball attack on Susie. And
Operation Kapow.
yeah, and so we get various labels and sort of commentary along the way for that whole thing.
Yes, that's right. Now, there's Barney's dad, the dad who lived to regret being mean to his kid, and then there's another story that Hobbes wrote called Goldilocks and the Three Tigers. Actually, Calvin and Hobbes may have co-wrote it. And in this one, well, would you like to summarize for us, Indy?
I would. So, as you can guess, this starts out very similarly to Goldilocks and the Three Bears. But then when we get to the crucial moment where the three tigers come home and discover Goldilocks is there, I believe the story goes, so they divided Goldilocks into big, medium, and small portions and dunked them into the porridge that, and then at this
Yeah.
point, the dad says, what? This is disgusting, Calvin. I'm not reading this. I don't know how I let you talk me into this. Good night.
Yeah.
And so Calvin and Hobbes then lament this for different reasons. So Calvin is sad. He says he didn't even look at our illustrations, and Hobbes goes, now I'm all hungry. So right, so that's obviously fun. But here's my question, and this is something I've thought about. I wonder what you think. What do you think the rest of that sentence or the story overall would have been?
I got to imagine the story was close to ending because they've divided Goldilocks into large, medium, and small portions, or whatever the phrasing was, and dunked her in the porridge. So, I mean, I've got to imagine it's something like, and, gobbled up the portions whole, and they were filled and lived happily ever after the end, or something like that. But I don't know. Do you think it goes beyond that?
You're probably right about that. I always wondered how that individual sentence was supposed to end too, though, because it says, and dunked them into the porridge that.
Hmm.
And so what I always came up with something like that had now turned red from her blood or something like that. Or
Yeah, I
I
could
don't
see
know.
why that wouldn't get included in the strip.
Right. I mean, it might be pushing the line a little bit to even have what happened, but yeah, I can see where you'd want to cut it off there. But that's just something I always was kind of curious about. It's like, well, how did that sentence end though? The porridge that what? It's,
Yeah. Please continue. Yeah.
yeah. You know, there's another one which is a little bit similar in just that Dad is reading Calvin the story of Little Red Riding Hood. I believe it's either that one or the Three Little Pigs.
Yeah.
I think it's Little
It's
Red
it's
Riding
no, it's Red Riding Hood, yeah.
Okay, but then because Calvin likes tigers, whenever the dad says wolf, Calvin makes him say tiger instead. It's like, oh, tiger, right. But then they get to the part where the hunter comes in, and in the original story, he shoots the wolf, and then, that's happily ever after.
Yeah.
But Dad hesitates when he gets to that point for obvious reasons. And Calvin's like,
Well,
well, what
yeah,
happened?
well, Calvin's dad is saying, and the hunter came, and Calvin says, and warning
Right. And
him.
then, yeah, so then Dad quickly and somewhat annoyedly, based on this expression, says, like, and it was too late. The tiger ate them all, the end, or something like
Yeah, and Hobbes cries for the happy ending.
that. Right. Yeah. And Calvin thinks this is a great story. So,
Yeah,
yeah, so we get the kind of, we get a sense of the differences between what Dad thinks is a good story and what Calvin thinks is a good story, which we'll come back to in a minute.
yeah, and just one more story written. This one is purportedly written entirely by Hobbes, and it's called An Ode to Tigers. And it starts out, the zebra's stripes are lacking hues, so they don't compare to you-know-whos. Orange, black, and white is what to wear. It's haute couture for those who dare, and goes on for a while. And Calvin even is a little annoyed by this one. Dad says, this goes on for pages. Pretty tedious, isn't it? So those are the stories that I can think of that Calvin and Hobbes came up with that Dad read to them or partially read to them. And then there's one case where Dad makes up a story about Calvin and Hobbes, sort of. He's basically just telling about their day, and he includes editorials about brain rotting TV and innard rotting chocolate cereal. Calvin does not approve of these editorials.
Right. But yeah, I think we might have mentioned this strip before too. It kind of ends in a sort of touching way because Calvin
Yeah,
gets mad that he doesn't finish the story. He only gets to just before lunchtime or something. And then we have this nice moment where his dad says something like, well, that's true. This story doesn't have an end. You and Hobbes are going to write more of it tomorrow and the day after that. But for now, it's time for bed. And this satisfies Calvin, actually. So this is,
yeah,
yeah, this is an instance of a pretty touching moment between the two of them.
yeah, yeah, it's true. And so that's a really good instance of one that has some funny parts about, hey, no editorials, but then also this really sweet ending to it. I like that.
Exactly. And this also shows that they both do editorials to each other. So obviously we have Barney's dad with a fairly obvious metaphor there, which is clearly an editorial. And then Calvin's dad does this too. So there's a bit of shots exchanged on that regard between them through their stories.
Right, right.
Now, I said before that Calvin and his dad often disagree on what a good bedtime story should be like. Now, that wasn't the case in the one we just talked about with a touching moment, but in a lot of cases, they tend to argue about this. And so the first one that comes to mind, we mentioned Hamster Huey, which, as we said, for different reasons. First, Dad thinks this will be great, and Calvin's skeptical. Oh, how good could it be if it hasn't been made into a TV movie or something like that? And then
Right.
later it switches, as we'll talk about in the future. Then there's the idea of traditional fairy tales. So we've talked about a couple of those with Little Red Riding Hood or Goldilocks, but there's also one, this is a visual only strip. And I don't think this was ever in newspapers, but it appeared at the bottom of a page in one of the book collections. And
Yeah.
we see, so the dad reading the story, and we see kind of a visual depiction of what's going on. And it's like the end of a Disney film, you might think. So you have
Mm.
clearly the prince and the beautiful princess, and there's all the woodland creatures around smiling and the castle in the background. And the dad has this sort of expression of wide-eyed wonder, thinking this is great. And then Calvin, we see, makes this kind of disgusted expression, like, ew, this is a gross story, or this,
Yeah.
blah, this prince and princess nonsense. So he doesn't think that's so great, even though the dad does. And then we have Calvin's idea for a fairy tale. And do you remember how this would go?
Okay. So there's the Little Red Riding Hood where
Right.
he wanted the tiger to eat the protagonists, and but there's another one where he wants like he mashes a bunch of fairy tales together. It's like Goldilocks gets eaten by the three bears, and then they team up with the big bad wolf and eat Little Red Riding Hood, and then Dad is like, so how should Hansel and Gretel meet their untimely demise? And Calvin is ready with a response. It's
Yes.
like,
The wolf eats, no, the witch eats them, and then the wolf eats the witch.
right, yeah,
Which that's one of my all-time favorite lines there, because
Yes.
yeah, the fact, like you said, he's ready for it. It's like, no, this is what we want. Just pack in devourment in as many cases as we possibly can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's Calvin's idea of a great story versus Dad's idea of a great story. And that kind of leads into maybe differences in their characters too, or what it takes to build character.
Right. Yeah. Because Calvin's dad is just all about building character. And this is another case where Watterson has said the strips about how misery builds character come from my own dad. So, just a few examples of ways in which Calvin is made to build character. So, shoveling the walk is a big one. We talked a little bit about that in the winter episode. That Calvin's like, "Why can't we get a snowblower?" And I'm miserable out here. And Calvin's dad leans out the door and says, "It builds character. Keep at it." And Calvin says, "Pretty convenient how every time I build character, he saves a few $100s." And just more generally being cold builds character in one of the camping strips. And we'll, again, this is another thing where we'll have a whole episode on this, but Calvin's dad says bug bites build character. And I gotta say this strip because it's one of my favorites. So they get to the place where they're camping, and Calvin says, "Good old Itchy Island, home of the nuclear mosquitoes." And so then they have this interchange about bug bites building character. And Calvin says something like, "Yeah, and last year you said diarrhea builds character." And then Dad says, "So think what a fine young man you're growing up to be." And Calvin says, "If all this character doesn't kill me first." And then Dad says, "Oh, that reminds me, open the duffel bag and get out the spam." So just this punch, 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 just all these funny lines right in a row in this one strip about building character. I love it.
Exactly. And I also think of one of my personal favorites is Calvin's dad is trying to help him learn how to play baseball better. I think this is connected to the playing baseball at recess story arc.
Mm-hmm.
So they go out to for him to try to practice or whatever. And then Calvin gets hit in the face with a ball. And so he gets this bloody nose. And then they go in and they're talking about what happened. And Calvin's like, my own dad is trying to kill me. He hit me with a ball. And then one of my all-time favorite lines. Now, his nose is supposed to be all stuffed up from the blood at this point, so I'll say it kind of like he does. All my character is dripping out my nose, which I love that because partially because it's so clever on Calvin's part. It's like, oh yeah, I was building character, and now it's all leaking out of me away. So I
Yeah.
love that even in this, he's in all this pain. He's still able to kind of rib on his dad's obsession with building character at this point.
Yep. And just because you said it in the way that Calvin said it, Watterson wrote Calvin with the stuffed up bloody nose a couple of places. So there's "My own dad is trying to kill me," and also "Find my note and pack it in ice so they can sew it back on." And the other one that I can remember is "I'm not playing baseball anymore. Never again. I hate it." So I think Watterson did a great job of writing how you sound when your nose is like that.
I agree. Hopefully, it's not from personal experience, but either
Well,
way,
yeah.
yeah, he did a great job with that. But yeah, that's one of my favorite lines, especially in a Calvin and Dad interchange. That he was building character, but now it's all dripping out his nose. So
Yes, that is a brilliant line. Also,
yeah,
on the note of how being cold builds character, in one strip, Calvin is asking why they can't raise up the thermostat, and Calvin's dad initially says they can't do it because uh, using fuel is bad for the environment and it wastes money. And Calvin seems generally okay with that answer. And then dad leans his head back into the frame and says, "And being cold builds character." And Calvin says, "I knew it," with a disgusted look on his face.
yeah, and that actually I believe is the antepenultimate Dad strip in the entirety of Calvin Hobbes, or the
Wow,
I just
that's
like
a
to say antepenultimate.
$10,000 word.
Yeah, that's any chance you get to say antepenultimate, I think you should take. But in more layman's term, the third, well, how do we say it? Second to last, I guess. So there's two, I believe, two more dad strips after this, and that's nearly the last time we ever see the dad character in Calvin and Hobbes,
Yeah.
which I think is interesting too, because how do we at least nearly end on then? Of
How do we
course,
send dad
with
off?
building character.
Yeah.
There's a similar example, though, again related to building character, where the dad cruelly, in Calvin's mind, forces Calvin to go play outside instead of watching TV. And so Calvin's mad at first and doesn't, but then we find out that he actually had a really good time running around outside with Hobbes. So then we find out that dad was proven right about this. So he comes out and says, "Oh, bedtime, time to come in." And Calvin says, "Oh, can't we stay out a little longer? Hobbes and I are catching fireflies." To which dad replies, "Ha, see, first you didn't want to go out. Now you don't want to come in. And now you'll have memories of something real you did instead of something fake you just watched on TV. And you had more fun doing it." And so then, dad's right. I mean, it seems even Calvin would probably have to admit this, but he does then say, "Nothing spoils fun like finding out it builds character."
Yep. And I believe we alluded to this one in a previous episode. So just one final note on building character, but we got to bring this one out here. In one strip, Calvin steals Dad's glasses, and Dad is looking for them and says, "I can't find them anywhere," and asking Mom where they could be. And then Calvin comes up wearing Dad's glasses and says, "Calvin, go do something you hate. Being miserable builds character." And Mom in the last panel is just dying laughing. She has the best expression on her face. And Dad says, "Okay, the voice was a little funny, but that's still one darn sarcastic kid we're raising." And just as an aside, I've had something kind of like that happen in real life. So one time my daughter grabbed my glasses and put them on and came up to me and said, "I'm a nerd." And she was probably 4 at the time. So clearly I have taught her well.
You have taught her well. Now, was
Yeah.
she mimicking your voice when she said that, or?
No, she was using her own voice, but I mean, I am a nerd, and as it happens, I wear glasses, so I fit the stereotype.
Right. No, that makes, I was just curious if it was like intentionally mocking like Calvin with his dad. But
Yeah, no,
that's very funny either way, though.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I enjoyed it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've probably said this before, but that strip you just mentioned with Calvin mocking his dad, dressing up like him, and that's one of my all-time favorites too, because I can just see a kid doing this, and the mother's expression, how funny she thinks it is, and the dad having to begrudgingly admit, okay, it actually is kind of funny. So that was always one that made me laugh a lot.
Yeah, that's a great one. On a similar note, so we've got Calvin kind of teasing Dad there, and Dad teases Calvin too. So they tease each other. In the Christmas episode, we talked about Dad teasing Calvin about the Christmas tree. "Oh, I think we'll just leave it in the garage this year," and everything. And that's probably the most famous example of Dad just straight up teasing Calvin about something. Calvin, of course, likes to tease Dad back. So there's the one where he calls Dad up at work and just says, "It sure is a nice day outside. Climb a tree, goof off." So they both give it to each other with what they think about life.
Right. And Calvin even explicitly kind of flags this. He says, "Well, dad harasses me with his value, so I harass him with mine."
Yeah. But on the note of teasing, we've got to get to this because I think this might be, at least I think it's my favorite thing about Dad. It might be a lot of people's, which is his fatherly wisdom. So there's some real fatherly wisdom that Dad likes to impart to Calvin. So, there's the actual wisdom flavor of, for instance, in our first episode, you mentioned the one where they're waiting for the hamburgers to cook, waiting for the grill to get hot enough actually to cook the hamburgers. And Calvin's dad is saying, it's sometimes the anticipation of the thing is better than the thing itself once you get it, and it's nice to just wait. And so he's imparting this wisdom to Calvin, and obviously Calvin completely misses the message. But then there's another one where Calvin wakes Dad up early in the morning on Father's Day and ribs him about the fatherly wisdom that he's imparting, saying that he is chosen to live his life by these principles. "So I was going to buy you a gift, but I didn't, because a penny saved is a penny earned, as you say," and all that sort of stuff.
Right, and he gets him up at I think like 5 a.m. because yes, early to bed, early to rise, as you always say. And then yeah, it concludes with him saying like, "Yes, thanks to you, Dad, I'm a better, happier person," or something. And then he walks out. And then do you remember how his mother reacts?
Oh, it's on the tip of my brain, but I'm not getting it there. You're gonna have to help me out on this one.
Okay, so she, while still trying to be asleep, says, "Well done, Socrates."
Yeah, I knew she referenced some like philosopher. I just couldn't get the exact wording to me. That's right, Socrates.
Yeah, so
Um,
case where I guess you could say Calvin did absorb his dad's genuine wisdom, but it backfires spectacularly.
Absolutely. And there's another one that's not quite the same, but it this one sort of blows up in Calvin's face, I guess. What I like this one, Dad shows Calvin a spinning record. Audience, you remember those? Some of you may not, but
The
a record is
record,
a big black disc and it spins around, and if you put the needle on it, it makes music. So, for our younger listeners, if we have any. But Dad is showing him how if you look at the center of the record, it's making a very slow circle. But if you look at the outside of the record, it has to make a full circle in the same time, but it's bigger, so it has to travel a farther distance, which means that 2 points on the same object are spinning at different rates. And that just blows Calvin's mind. In the last panel, he's sitting in bed, clutching his pillow with his eyes wide open, just, what the heck did I just learn? Sort of an expression.
yeah, and it's funny too because you don't, or at least I don't get the impression that his father was trying to tease him or anything with this. It's just like, oh, hey, look at this interesting thing. But then,
Yeah.
yeah, Calvin can't even sleep because, like, wait, how does this make any sense? And he just can't grasp it.
Yeah. And speaking of not grasping things, I think that leads nicely into possibly everyone's favorite thing about Dad, which is where he feeds him absolute garbage about how the world works. For example, Calvin asks Dad to explain how the theory of relativity works. He doesn't understand why time goes slower as you go faster. And so Calvin's dad says, well, it's because you keep changing time zones. See, if you fly from New York to Los Angeles, you gain 3 hours on a 5 hour flight. And if you go at the speed of light, you gain even more time because you get there faster. And of course, the theory of relativity only works if you're going west.
To which Calvin replies, well, that's not what Mom said at all. She must be completely off her rocker.
Yeah.
And
And
then, oh, yeah, you know Dad's response, I'm sure.
yes, he says, well, we men are better at abstract reasoning than women. You go tell her that.
Right, which shows that he doesn't only enjoy teasing Calvin, he likes teasing his wife too.
Yeah. And
Yeah, which
that sometimes goes better for him than other times.
that's true. Yeah, but I like that because it gives again another dimension of him as a real seeming person. It's like, oh yeah, here's
Yeah.
here's someone who is very serious and really does believe that character is important and does try to live as a good role model, but he still enjoys teasing his child and his wife and having fun in this way, which I think makes him more well-rounded, as well as
Yeah.
for us providing sources of humor in the strips. I also think, on a more serious note, that this whole interchange says something interesting about human beings and how we tend to desire simple answers and explanations for things, even when it separates us from the truth. So we see Calvin here thinking, oh, well, this thing about changing time zones, that's sensible. I mean, that's a real sounding explanation. That must be the truth. Whatever complicated nonsense Mom was saying, she must be crazy. And
Yeah.
I think this is something we can all fall into a little bit, where we want to believe that something we already understand makes more sense than something we don't, or something that sounds complicated. Like on a personal note, I remember one time when I was teaching, and then my students had some kind of question. I was trying to explain it, and they were complaining. They're like, "Why can't you just give us a simple answer?" And I said, "Well, you want a simple answer, but you ask a complicated question." And so this didn't really satisfy them. They still accused me of trying to overcomplicate things, but I was trying to say, well, no, this really is more complex and nuanced than you're thinking of it. But that's just sort of a personal thing I think of sometimes. But in general, I think that we tend to do this. Like we want things to be simpler than they are, and maybe we run away from the truth sometimes because of that.
Yeah, this wasn't one that I was going to bring up, but it makes me think of one where Calvin asks Dad where wind comes from, and Dad says, trees sneezing. And Calvin says, really? And Calvin's dad says, no, but the truth is more complicated. And so then in the last panel, it's windy, and Calvin and Hobbes are walking outside, and Calvin says, the trees are really sneezing today. So in that case, Calvin's dad actually admits that his answer is bogus, but Calvin doesn't want to know the real answer because it's too complicated.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. There's
Yeah.
also one, it's not exactly the same theme, but it reminds me where Calvin asks his dad something and he says something like, well, go look it up and find out. And Calvin says, I should just look this stuff up in the first place. And his dad says, you can
Yeah.
learn a lot talking to me.
Yep, that's a good one. A couple more bogus ones that I just want to bring up quickly. So Calvin is asking Dad about where the sun goes when it sets, and how big the sun is and stuff. And so Dad says, "Well, the sun goes out at night as it sets. That's why it gets dark." And Calvin says, "Well, where does it go?" Well, it lands in Arizona somewhere, actually, near Flagstaff. That's why the rocks are so red. And Calvin says, like, don't the people get crushed? Oh, no, no, hold up a quarter. See, the sun is just about the same size, and just giving him all this nonsense about the sun. I enjoyed that one.
Exactly. And in fact, funnily enough, on that one, Calvin then says, I thought I read somewhere that the sun is really big. And his dad says, you can't believe everything you read, I'm afraid.
Yeah,
So,
I think that might be the one where at the end Calvin is in bed and he says, "Wow, I hope someday I'm as smart as Dad." And his mom says, "Why? What did he tell you now?"
oh yeah, this is kind of a running gag there, and his mother is usually not nearly as amused as his father is about these tall tales.
Yes. And then I think my personal favorite, Calvin asks why old photographs are in black and white. Didn't they have color film back then? Well, of course we did, but the world was black and white back then. So these are color photographs of a black and white world. And then Calvin is asking about, well, but there are paintings that are in color. How could the artists doesn't make any sense? And Calvin says, well, a lot of artists were crazy. But how could they have painted in color? Wouldn't their paints have been in shades of gray? And Dad says something like, well, it's time for bed.
Yeah,
But
I would agree, and I would also say that's probably my favorite one of those strips too. Just not only the continual, more ridiculous explanations, but also the father's expressions. Like when he talks about, oh, well, this is because a lot of great artists were crazy. He just has this really, I don't even quite know how to describe it. It's almost like smug, but not quite expression on his face when he says that. And that makes me laugh almost as much as the line itself. It's like, well, that's what happened. And then even probably the last thing he says there, because Calvin's saying, well, wait, if the world turned color, then shouldn't the old photographs also have turned color like it did? And he said, well, no, because those were color pictures of black and white. So obviously it makes sense that they're still black and white because that,
yeah,
yeah, it's kind of head spinning thing where there's technically an explanation for almost all of it at least. But yeah, I would agree with you. That is one of my favorite strips overall, and certainly my favorite dad explanation to Calvin of how things supposedly work.
yeah. And there are others, listeners. Feel free to let us know your favorites if there's one we didn't mention, but so good. And Indy, I will give you one guess because we've been talking for almost an hour and a half now about Dad, so we probably ought to wrap it up. But I'll give you one guess what Dad strip you think we should end on.
Well, I would have to say the one we've talked about a couple times before, and that is the silent strip where Calvin and Calvin's dad eventually build a snowman together. My guess is that would be the most fitting one to end on.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a good strip, and it highlights so well Calvin and Dad's relationship. And despite the teasing and ribbing and disagreement about stuff, that they have a good father-son relationship, and Dad is willing to put down his work to go play with Calvin on a snowy day, and I just love it. It's so good.
I do too. And I think, you're a father. I'm not, but certainly I have family members and we all know the
Yeah,
bonds and how important they are. And just And like you were alluding to, even though there's so much clashing between them, both implicitly and explicitly with the values, like you said, they actually do have a really good father-son relationship. There really is this genuine love there. And so I would agree that that strip, we've praised it several times before, and it's a really fitting place to stop, at least for right now.
Yeah, and we'll have more listeners. Again, if there's anything else that we didn't say about Dad that you would say is just essential to Dad's character, let us know. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at magiccandh@proton.me. So that's magiccandh@proton.me. If that's a lot to remember, there will also be a link in the description for the episode, so you can just click on that if you have anything you'd like to let us know. We would always love to hear from you. We would love it if you'd give us a review. If you're enjoying what we're doing, share it with your friends, let them know about us. We would love for people to come join us as we celebrate Calvin and Hobbes.
And as always, we celebrate Calvin and Hobbes without ads and an entirely free format. So we just want to share our love with this iconic strip with you, and we hope you'll come along with us.
Yes, absolutely. Come join us and let's go exploring. You've been listening to The Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. We'll be releasing 40 episodes all throughout the year, from November 18th, 2025 to November 18th, 2026, to celebrate the 40th anniversary. Our intro and outro music is Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, referenced in the Calvin and Hobbes strip published on October 8th, 1986. This rendition was performed by the Skidmore College Orchestra and made available under a Creative Commons license on museopen.com. We hope you'll join us next episode for more fun.